Before the skyscrapers, before the headlines, before people whispered his name with awe or envy, there was only cold. The kind of cold that creeps through cracked walls, that makes you breathe smoke in your own kitchen, that folds itself into the corners of your clothes because the heating bill went unpaid again. That's where his story starts, not in gold but in grit. He lived in the kind of apartment landlords forgot, a dim space with a chipped sink and humming lights that flickered as though they were too tired to live another day. The rent was late. His shoes were patched twice over. His phone buzzed with calls not from partners or investors, but from creditors demanding the little he didn't have. And still he dreamed. The world called him broke. He called himself unfinished. Every night, while the city outside wrapped itself in comfort, he hunched over a desk scavenged from a second-hand store, scribbling ideas until his fingers cramped. He wanted more than survival, he wanted to create something that outlasted him. But poverty is a thief. It steals not just money but time, dignity, and hope. And then there was her. She didn't fall for the dream, not at first. She fell for the boy beneath it, stubborn, reckless, sometimes foolish but unwilling to bow to despair. They had met at a friend's kitchen party, crowded and noisy, where most people were too busy dancing to notice the quiet boy in the corner sketching designs on a napkin. She'd asked what he was doing. He looked up, caught off guard, and for the first time spoke aloud the ideas he usually kept locked in his head. She listened, really listened, and something about that softened his edges. They saw each other more after that night, always in places that cost little, park benches, library corners, cheap diners where coffee came free with meals. She didn't care about what he had. She cared about who he was, a man drowning yet still gasping upward for light. But love in poverty isn't always tender. It is practical, relentless, tested daily against hunger and exhaustion. She worked shifts at a small shop, folding clothes and counting hours. Her paycheck barely covered her bus fares. He chased work that never lasted. Day labor, temporary gigs, anything that left enough of a gap to chase his impossible sketches and visions at night. Together they learned to laugh at emptiness. When the fridge groaned with nothing but eggs and cheap noodles, she turned it into comedy, calling herself a chef of scarcity. When eviction notices piled, he tacked them on the wall like trophies, vowing one day they'd be artifacts of a world they had conquered. She rolled her eyes, but secretly admired his refusal to let despair defeat him. Yet slowly the struggle tested even laughter. When he stayed up too long, chasing visions that never sold, when he missed her texts because he was drowning in notebooks, she wondered quietly if she was loving a dream more than a man. When another month's rent slipped behind and she worked extra shifts to cover groceries, she felt the quiet bitterness of imbalance. "Do you love me?" she asked one night, voice trembling. He looked up from his desk, bleary-eyed, startled. "More than anything." "Then why do I feel like I'm competing with your ideas?" she whispered. It was the first crack, faint but sharp. He crossed the room, took her hands, pressed them against his chest. "Because I'm not doing this without you. Everything I'm chasing, it's for us. Not for me. Not for some empty throne. For us." She wanted to believe. And she stayed. Years later, the world would marvel at his rise, at how he went from nothing to an empire, but nobody would ever see those nights. Nights where she chose faith over fear, where she kissed him on the forehead when food was scarce, where love didn't come dressed in roses and champagne but in whispered encouragements under dim light. In secret, her faith was the anchor that held him. Without her, the storm would have dragged him under long before the climb began. But love, as it always does, would not protect them quietly. Because ambition demands sacrifice, and every step up the ladder would begin to test not only his willpower, but the very bond that had kept him alive. Breakthroughs never arrive with fanfare. They creep in disguised as chance opportunities. His came on a damp Tuesday, when most of the city trudged through puddled sidewalks without noticing. He was running odd jobs to buy groceries when a colleague on one project noticed the sketches stuffed in his notebook. At first the man laughed, rough, dismissive. Then he frowned. Then he handed him a card. "Talk to my brother. He invests in small startups. Might at least hear you out." It was nothing, just a sliver of chance. But to someone who has scraped for years, even slivers glimmer like open skies. That meeting was the first spark. Soon, long nights stretched into longer nights, but now there was momentum. Investors began to listen. His ideas, once paper tossed aside, were circulating. Not yet millions, barely thousands, but possibilities. For the first time he saw doors crack open that were forever locked. He ran home that evening to tell her. She was kneeling by the stove, stirring pasta in their dented pot. He grabbed her hands, his eyes glowing. "They're interested," he burst out. "They want me to pitch again. This could be it." She smiled, proud, glowing, but behind her eyes flickered something else, fear. "That's amazing," she said softly. "But make sure you don't forget to eat. Make sure you don't forget me." He laughed, pulling her into an embrace. "Forget you? You're why I'm doing this." For a while the light burned bright. Every victory was theirs to share. The day he scraped together enough money to buy better clothes for his meetings, she ironed his shirt proudly. The moment he landed his first investors, she celebrated with him despite knowing the money wouldn't reach them for months. Together they dreamed of stability, of a life where bills didn't weigh heavier than sleep. But success is a dangerous lover. It offers gifts with one hand while stealing time with the other. Meetings swelled. Deadlines multiplied. His notebook filled with sketches and models, but their conversations thinned with silence. Dinner grew colder as he returned later each night, glowing with ambition but absent in presence. She sat at the table, chewing alone, listening for footsteps that returned long after her eyes had closed. She never stopped supporting him. She slipped notes of encouragement into his bag, left coffee by his desk. But in secret she kept a journal too. In it she wrote, "He's winning the world. I just pray he doesn't lose us." One night, after weeks of late hours, she finally voiced what the pages had been holding. "I can't remember the last time you looked at me the way you look at those sketches." The words stung. He dropped his pen, turning toward her, guilt flashing. "I'm building this for us. Do you think I'd work this hard if I didn't care about you?" Tears burned her eyes. "I don't want the empire. I want the man who used to sit with me on park benches and hold my hand like the whole world was in it." Silence weighed heavy between them. She turned away before his apologies reached her. But ambition pushed forward. Investors demanded more time. Competitors emerged. He sank deeper, convinced that if he simply succeeded faster, it would all be worth it. He promised himself, and her, that this was temporary. That love didn't need constant attention because it was strong, resilient. The test he didn't see was that love doesn't crumble in storms, it crumbles in neglect. Still she stayed. Through every missed dinner, every late return, every moment she whispered a good night into empty air, she stayed. But faith is not infinite. It trembles, shakes, and eventually demands proof. Her friends began to question her patience. "He's changing," they warned. "He's choosing ambition over you." She defended him fiercely, but doubt seeped through cracks in her heart. Was she loved, or was she merely tolerated while he chased his crown? The climb accelerated. The broke boy was no longer scraping. He was rising. Slowly, painfully, but undeniably. Deals clicked into place. His name began to whisper louder in small circles of money and power. For the first time, opportunities reached for him instead of him chasing them down. And yet every new step upward dragged him another step away from the woman who had carried him through hunger and fear. One evening she waited up for him. The clock glared past midnight when he finally arrived, shoulders heavy with meetings and exhaustion. She rose from the couch, her voice quiet but steady. "I have to ask, are you still in this with me, or just with your dream?" He dropped his bag, staring at her with frustration and helplessness. "They aren't separate. You're my dream. Everything I'm fighting for is because of you." "Then fight for us too," she whispered, tears trembling in her eyes. "Because right now, I feel like the test I'm failing is waiting for you to remember I exist." He had no answer. Only silence. It was the first true fracture. For the first time, she wondered if love could survive the climb, or if ambition would strangle it before fortune ever arrived. Little did they know this was only the beginning of the hardest test. Because wealth wasn't simply about gaining fortune, it was about losing pieces of oneself along the way. And love, fragile but fierce, would demand to know, was he rising as her partner, or leaving her beneath him as an artifact of the boy he used to be? Success doesn't knock politely, it floods the door, kicking it open and sweeping everything else into the current. By the end of that year his phone never stopped buzzing. Investors wanted longer meetings. Partners wanted faster returns. Journalists wanted sound bites. Suddenly, the same world that once ignored him was leaning in, eager, hungry to attach itself to his climb. And to the rest of the world it looked glorious. The man who once scraped coins for rent was becoming something rare, a rising star. His name began to circle in the orbit of people he'd once worshipped from afar. Articles began calling him promising, glossing photos of him shaking hands in rooms he never believed he'd enter. But glory cast the harshest shadows. The higher he rose, the further away she felt. Nights turned into early mornings, his place at the dinner table an empty chair she stopped setting. Her texts grew shorter, his replies slower. He promised her again and again this was temporary, that soon they'd breathe, soon they'd celebrate, soon they'd live the life they once laughed about on broken park benches. But temporary began to feel permanent. And then came temptation. It wasn't always glamorous, not at first. Just lingering glances from women at events, smiles with hints of suggestion, conversations with undertones she couldn't hear but he could feel. The world that once mocked him now adored him, and with adoration came attention of the most dangerous kind. Shallow, intoxicating, effortless. She noticed the look in his eyes when he returned late from galas, the scent of perfumes that weren't hers clinging faintly to his jacket. She never accused him. Love deserves trust until the last possible moment, but the questions churned inside her chest, unspoken weights. And he, though he never betrayed her physically, began to betray her in subtler ways. In the moments he chose to linger in conversations instead of racing home. In the meetings where he let himself enjoy the attention instead of remembering who had held his hand through hunger and dark. The test wasn't a single moment. It was thousands of invisible needles pricking slowly, pulling them apart thread by thread. One night, she confronted him after an awards dinner. He had returned glowing with champagne praise, an engraved plaque under his arm. She sat on the couch, arms crossed, eyes piercing. "You don't smile at me like that anymore," she said softly. His glow faltered. "Like what?" "Like you did tonight when that woman leaned in too close. Like you were shining. When was the last time my presence lit you like that?" Her words sliced him. He sat heavily, the weight of guilt crashing harder than applause ever lifted. "I haven't touched anyone. You have to believe me." She nodded slowly. "Maybe. But you've been touching absence. And absence hurts more than betrayal sometimes." That night was the quietest they'd shared. Not a storm of anger, just silence deep enough to feel like goodbye waiting in the shadows. Meanwhile the world cheered louder. That contrast haunted her. To them he was brilliance. To her he was vanishing. It came to a breaking point when one evening he invited her to a gala. He wanted her to see him celebrated, to prove somehow that the distance was worthwhile. She agreed reluctantly. The room sparkled with chandeliers and diamond laughter. Cameras flashed. He introduced her proudly, holding her hand, but throughout the night people brushed past her, their gazes laced with doubt. She wasn't glamorous enough, they whispered. She wasn't the type. She wasn't polished for this life. She smiled politely, but her eyes dimmed. Later in the car she finally spoke. "Do you see what they see when they look at me?" "I see the woman who got me here," he said fiercely. "No," she whispered. "You see her in secret. But in those rooms you let them tell a different story. You shine for them. You're just polite with me. Like I'm a placeholder, not your partner." Her words broke something inside him. He realized then the true cost of ambition. Not loss of sleep, not endless hours, but the erosion of love in the quiet spaces. The test was sharp, brutal, merciless, and he was failing. But she stayed even then. Not because she was blind, but because she clung to the memory of the boy sketching designs on a napkin in that crowded kitchen, the one who swore he dreamed for them, not for himself alone. As cracks deepened, she whispered still, "I need you to prove it wasn't just ambition speaking that night. I need you to remember me." He promised. He always promised. But deep in his chest, fear coiled. Promises meant little without action. And if he didn't change he would lose her, not because of betrayal but because of neglect. And love's cruelest test isn't whether you stray, it's whether you forget. The headline came on a blinding morning, bold across newspapers and scrolling at the bottom of every television screen. From broke to billionaire, the remarkable rise of a visionary. It should have been his crowning achievement. For the world it was proof of legend. For him, it was supposed to be the moment where every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every missed meal finally made sense. He stood in front of the glass windows of his new office tower, watching the city glitter beneath him. He was now part of the sky, untouchable, the boy from the cracked apartment transformed into power incarnate. But behind the glass, his reflection showed more truth than the city ever would. Eyes shadowed, exhaustion etched deep, and loneliness beneath a thin smile. She wasn't there that morning. She hadn't been there to clink glasses the night before at the celebration. She hadn't been there when reporters flooded in asking about family, support, love. They praised his vision, toasted his empire, and never noticed the empty space beside him. She had stayed home. Quiet, distant, tired. When he finally returned to their apartment, with cameras long gone, applause echoing only in memory, she was curled on the couch with a book unopened in her lap. He dropped the news in the air like a gift. I made it. The papers say it, I'm a billionaire. She looked up slowly, her face unreadable. And what am I supposed to say to that? He frowned. Say you're proud of me. Say this was worth it. Her lips curled into something sad. Was it? The silence between them was heavier than the checkbook stacked in his office. He sat, frustration burning. All those nights, all the times I stayed late, all the things I promised, they weren't lies. I told you this was for us. She closed the book without reading a single page. Her voice broke. Do you know how many dinners I ate alone while you were out chasing for us? Do you know how many times I told myself your love for me still mattered, even while your eyes were glued to everything else but me? The words cut. He reached for her, but she pulled back gently. Not with anger, with fatigue. A weariness that frightened him more than fury. Your dream won, she whispered. But I think we lost. It was the sharpest test yet. Not in his work, where he thrived, but in his heart, where he was failing. Over the weeks that followed, his empire sparkled while his love wilted. He signed deals worth numbers he couldn't fathom, but she stopped smiling at his returns. He addressed conference halls of thousands, but her silence at home echoed louder than applause. Temptation stalked him harder now. Invitations arrived daily, lavish galas, glamorous women, circles that wanted him untethered, unburdened by the ordinary girl, who had been with him before he was anyone. And the worst part? Some nights he almost gave in, not out of lack of love, but out of fear that the man she once loved had died along the way. But every time another voice whispered promises of easier affection, he remembered the nights of noodles, the laughter and hunger, the way she had once told him, do not forget me. And those memories held him back, though barely at times. Then came the breaking point. A gala invitation had arrived, the grandest yet. Cameras, spotlights, prestige. He begged her to come, hoping if she stood beside him for this, maybe they could bridge the gulf. She reluctantly said yes. But that night was worse than he feared. The hall was drenched in chandeliers and glitz, guests sparkling with wealth. Everyone recognized him, everyone wanted him. And everyone looked twice at her, judgment sharp in their glances. Whispers slithered in the air, she doesn't belong. Why her? He could have anyone. He felt her hands stiffen in his, her smile brittle. All night, she stood half a step behind him as cameras flashed, never in the center, always in the shadow. He didn't notice until too late because he was too busy answering questions, laughing, shining. On the ride home, a silence stretched sharp as glass. Finally she spoke. I can't do this anymore. His chest collapsed. Don't say that. Her voice quivered, but her eyes stayed firm. I've loved you from nothing. I stood by you when nobody else cared. But somewhere along the climb I lost you. Or maybe, she paused, voice breaking, maybe you lost yourself. Tears burned in his eyes, but pride gagged him. He wanted to argue, wanted to explain, but deep inside he knew she was right. That night she packed a small bag. He begged. He pleaded. Not with words of a billionaire, but words of a desperate man. Don't go. Please. You're the only thing that's kept me alive through all of this. She stopped in the doorway with her bag slung over her arm. Her reply was simple but irreversible. Then find yourself first. Because I can't love a man who doesn't even know who he is anymore. And she left. The man who had gone from broke to billionaire stood in his penthouse surrounded by glass, marble, and silence. The city roared below in envy and admiration. The empire was his, but everything it was built for had slipped out of his hands. The world thought his greatest challenge was money. They were wrong. His greatest test had just begun, and it was the test of whether love could survive ambition's cruelty. The penthouse was silent. Not the soft silence of peace, but the heavy kind, the kind that presses against your skull, amplifying every tick of the clock, every hum of the refrigerator until it feels like the walls themselves accuse you. She was gone. Her clothes no longer hung in the closet. Her books no longer cluttered the couch. The single tulip she'd placed in a chipped vase had withered, shrunken into itself, with no one to refresh the water. The empire had grown larger than ever, but his world had shrunk until it barely filled the space of his echoing rooms. At first, he drowned in distraction. Meetings by the hour. Deals that rolled in like tidal waves. Friends, if they could be called that, invited him to fill the void with noise, drinks, women, luxury. He knew what they expected, for him to bury his pain under gold, to replace the love he lost with applause. But he didn't. He attended the meetings. He signed the papers. He shook the hands. And yet he moved like a man underwater, each gesture hollow, numb. Reporters asked him about his meteoric success. He answered flatly as though reading from a script. Photographers begged him for one of his famous smiles, but the curve of his lips no longer reached his eyes. At night, beneath the sky-high windows of his penthouse, he remembered the voice that trembled but never broke. Find yourself first. Because I can't love a man who doesn't even know who he is anymore. Those words looped endlessly. Find yourself. Who was he really? The boy from the cracked apartment? The billionaire celebrated by magazines? The man who whispered promises across cheap noodles? Or the ghost now haunting success, alone in his palace? He tried to answer by going through the motions. He bought new cars, new watches, tried on new victories like costumes. Each one fit worse than the last. Because none of them silenced the memory of late nights when she wrapped her arms around him and whispered faith into dreams that hadn't yet survived the world. Without her, every triumph rotted. He realized slowly that he had mistaken success for love itself. He thought fortune could prove his devotion, that empire could serve as evidence of worthiness. But love hadn't needed evidence. It had needed presence, attention, simplicity. And he had failed her. Weeks turned into months, the emptiness unrelenting. He tried calling. She never answered. He tried sending letters. None came back. Perhaps she was gone forever, perhaps she had chosen a quiet world away from the noise of his. Could he blame her? The answer was no. He blamed only himself. And yet, love has a strange resilience. Even when broken, even when buried, it lingers like embers beneath ash. And though he couldn't see her, he could feel her absence forming the shape of purpose he had long ignored. She was right. If he didn't know himself anymore, then maybe it was time to stop building towers for others and start dismantling the illusions inside. For the first time in years, he canceled meetings. He turned down deals. Assistants panicked, investors protested. But he ignored them. Instead, he walked through his empire not as its king but as a stranger observing what he'd created. Factories running without faces attached. Boardrooms humming with greed more than vision. Charities in name only, built for tax shelters, not change. For the first time it made him sick. This was what he had sacrificed love for. Marble halls with emptiness in their echo, applause of people who barely knew his name beyond headlines. And for what? That night, he sat in his penthouse, staring at the skyline and whispered into the silence, all of this and yet nothing. The next morning he did something unthinkable. He walked the streets of his old neighborhood. He passed the cracked apartments, the graffiti-stained walls, the corner shop where she once rang up groceries with her tired smile. People didn't recognize him immediately, not under his simple hoodie and worn sneakers. But he recognized himself. He saw the boy who started here, the woman who found him here, the love that built him before ambition bent him. When he returned that evening, the empty penthouse was unbearable. He grabbed a jacket, a notebook and left again, not to a gala but into the quiet corners of the city. He wrote. He walked. He stripped away layer after layer of wealth's illusions until he finally faced a reflection he hadn't met in years. A man who'd been chasing everything but forgetting himself along the way. His phone rang constantly during those weeks, but he let them buzz into silence. He wasn't lost in work anymore. He was searching for himself, not the billionaire, not the boy, but the man who could still sit with her, hand in hand, without crowns and without crutches. For the first time he understood, the real climb wasn't broke to billionaire. It was broke boy to whole man. But the test wasn't finished. Love had given him space to find himself, but would it welcome him back after all he had let fall apart? There was one thing left to do. He would have to go to her, not as a king begging a subject's return, not as a billionaire flashing gestures, but as the same boy she had once found sketching on napkins. The boy who loved her first, not with wealth but with wonder. He gathered his courage. And one quiet night, with the city buzzing below, he whispered into the sky, "This story isn't over yet." Finding her wasn't simple. He could have asked assistance. He could have paid investigators. He could have pulled strings the way billionaires do, but that would have betrayed everything he was trying to reclaim. If he truly wanted her back, it had to be different this time. So he retraced her world instead. He started at the shop where she used to work, the place with fluorescent lights and endless folded stacks of clothes. The manager barely remembered her, just a vague nod that she'd left that job long ago. He moved on. Next came the coffee shop where they'd spent lean afternoons, sipping one cup between them to stretch their coins. The staff had changed, but the table was still there, the one near the window with the cracked seat. He sat there in silence for hours, notebook open but blank, remembering her laugh bouncing across that glass as she teased him about his stubborn dreams. Days blurred into weeks. Each place gave him fragments but no directions. He didn't know if she had moved across the city or across the world. But every step of the search stripped him further from the billionaire who wanted easy shortcuts. Instead, he became something else, a man patient enough to chase love with persistence, not power. And then one spring morning he saw her. Not on a stage. Not in some dramatic reveal. She was simply walking down the street, bag strapped across her shoulder, a paper cup of tea in hand. She looked different. Tired in some ways, stronger in others, her steps carrying the independence of someone who had survived heartbreak and built routines around absence. His chest tightened. So much so that for a moment he almost couldn't move. But then her eyes lifted, caught his across the crowd, and froze. Their gazes locked. She didn't smile, didn't run, didn't soften. She simply stopped, staring at him like a ghost had materialized. He approached slowly, carefully, not wanting to erase the fragile seconds between them. When he finally stood before her, his voice was gentle, almost breaking. "I've been looking for you." Her reply was brittle. "Why? You already have everything." He shook his head. "No. Without you it's nothing. I thought I was building something great, but I built walls instead. I let them close around me and I shut you out. I needed to step away to see it all fall silent, to realize I had nothing without you." She looked away, clenching her jaw. "Words are easy. Especially for someone like you who's good at convincing rooms to believe anything." He lowered his eyes, then pulled out his notebook, the same one he'd carried during his weeks of reflection. Pages filled with scribbles, confessions, regrets. He handed it to her carefully. "Then don't believe my words. Believe the man you see written here," he said quietly. Cautiously she flipped through. The pages bled with vulnerability. Not numbers, not strategies, not designs, but raw thoughts scrawled in tired ink. She was right. Love isn't proof through fortune, it's proof through presence. How do I become him again, the man who sat on park benches with her? If she ever gives me one more chance, I'll spend my life proving she's worth more than everything I chased. Her hands trembled as she closed the notebook. Emotions flickered across her face, anger, sorrow, longing, all tangled into something she couldn't yet name. Finally she whispered, "Why now? Why after everything?" He met her gaze, his tone steady. "Because I finally found myself, the man you told me to become. And the only thing that matters now is showing him to you. The boy who dreamed, yes, but also the man who learned that love is worth more than empires." Silence stretched between them, filled by the shouts of vendors and city traffic. For a moment, it felt as though her answer might shatter him again. Then she sighed, shaking her head softly. "You hurt me," she said, "in ways I still don't know if I can forgive. But you're here. And that means something." Hope sparked, fragile but alive. "I don't ask for forgiveness today," he said firmly. "Just a chance to show you I remember how to love. Not in secret, not in absence. But here in every moment." She studied him for a long pause, then finally extended her hand, the one simple gesture that meant, not yet, but maybe. He took it cautiously, holding it as though it might vanish. And in that instant the test was clear. Becoming a billionaire had never been the real trial. Becoming a man who could hold love with both hands, that was. Reconciliation didn't arrive wrapped in ribbon. It came in hesitation. In careful steps. In questions that weren't spoken aloud but weighed down the air between them. She agreed to see him again but not often. Coffee at the familiar shop. Walks along the park paths where they'd once built laughter out of nothing. Every meeting felt like testing cracks in glass. Was it strong enough to hold or would it splinter again? He took nothing for granted. When she spoke, he listened, not the polite listening of a man multitasking, but deeply as though each word were a compass realigning his life. If her hand brushed his, he didn't squeeze or push forward. He waited, letting her pace guide the rhythm of their return. And she tested him, quietly but deliberately. Once, she asked about a meeting she'd seen splashed across headlines, an event where investors begged him to consider stepping back into the spotlight. "You didn't go," she said simply. "No," he answered. "You could have rebuilt from that. Regained everything." He shook his head. "I already have everything worth keeping." Her eyes flicked over him, measuring the conviction. He held her gaze, not flinching. Another time, she insisted on cooking dinner for them at her own small place. The meal was burnt, smoke hissed from the pan, laughter filled the room when she cursed at the oven. Years before, he might have brushed it off, offered to call a private chef, sacrificed the imperfect moment for something dazzling. But not now. He ate every bite, even the charred edges, and grinned between mouthfuls. "Best dinner I've had in years." She rolled her eyes, chuckling. But in her gaze lingered something warm, because she saw he wasn't chasing novelty anymore. He was cherishing simplicity. Still, scars remained. There were days when shadows of the past pulled at her. When his phone buzzed one too many times, old fears crept in. He's slipping away again. I'll lose him to ambition. He noticed her silence on those days. Noticing was the first proof, because before he hadn't. And instead of brushing her worries away, he answered them. "Turn it off," he said once, holding his phone. He clicked it into silence, sliding it face down on the table. "I'm with you. The rest of the world can wait." The gesture was small. It was also everything. Because actions, not speeches, rebuild trust. Gradually, she began to lean into him again. The walls she carried loosened, though not all at once. They shared more hours together. They teased one another with old rhythms. They found themselves laughing at small things. A bird stealing crumbs off a table, the absurd drama of neighbors across her building, which reminded them both that love had roots deeper than failure. And yet, beneath the warmth, a final unspoken challenge lingered. She needed to know, was this change permanent or temporary? Could he truly live without the siren call of success? Would he sacrifice again if fame tempted, or would his presence slip back into absence the second the world clapped for him? She put words to it one night as they walked along the river. Lights shimmered across the water, and her hand rested lightly in his when she finally asked, "What if someone offered you twice what you ever dreamed of tomorrow? What if you could be twice as rich, twice as powerful as you were, just by signing?" He stopped walking, looked at her seriously. "Then I'd ask if the deal meant I'd still have evenings like this, your hand, your voice, your smile. If the answer's no, the deal's worthless." She studied him carefully. His voice was calm, without a trace of performance. The boy who once begged success to prove his love was gone. The man before her didn't need to beg. He'd already chosen. Her lips trembled into the faintest smile before she looked away, smothering it. But the warmth in her eyes betrayed her. She was beginning to believe again. Later, when he kissed her goodnight, she let herself lean into him fully for the first time in months. He held her reverently, as if sealing a vow not with words, but with presence. For him, every small sign of her trust restored was more valuable than any mansion or applause he'd ever received. Because the true test of love was no longer coming in shadows or sirens. It was happening here, daily, in the quiet choices that built them back piece by fragile piece. And slowly, surely they were winning. But the greatest test was still ahead, not in temptation, not in billion-dollar deals, but in a choice they would face together. Whether their future could be built not on wealth, but on the life they once whispered to each other when everything seemed impossible. It began in whispers, almost shy at first. They'd be sitting on the couch after dinner, bowls stacked in the sink, her head leaning against his shoulder, and out of nowhere she'd murmur, What if we lived by the sea? He'd smile faintly, brushing his thumb across her hand. Which sea? Doesn't matter, she'd laugh softly. As long as I can hear waves in the morning instead of alarm clocks. And so the dreaming began. Not the dreams of his old world, no charts, no graphs, no margins measured in millions. These dreams were gentler, spoken like secrets meant only for the two of them. A cottage with crooked shutters. Walls lined not with art auctions but with her books. A piano in the corner, not surrounded by chandeliers but by stacks of notebooks and mismatched chairs. At night, they scribbled their someday list on napkins and scraps of paper. Tulip beds by the windows. A big table for friends filled with laughter, not deals. Late walks under skies without city lights. A study where she could write undisturbed, papers scattered like snow on the floor. A little woodshop or workspace for him, where he could build with his hands what he used to buy with signatures. The more they dreamed, the more alive they felt. One evening she challenged him, teasing but sincere. So, Mr. Former Billionaire, what would you call our empire now if you had to give it a name? He chuckled, thoughtful. The empire of everyday. She rolled her eyes affectionately. That sounds like a self-help book. Maybe, he admitted, but it's also true. Because what we have now, the way you look at me when I burn dinner, the way we laugh over nothing, the way we wrestle grocery bags up 3 flights of stairs, that's the empire I'd fight for. Every day. She smiled, tucking herself under his arm. Then promise me you'll never expand it. We don't need skyscrapers in the empire of every day. I promise. And he meant it. For the first time in his life he felt no hunger to climb higher, no compulsion to chase bigger. Ambition was no longer a fever. It had shrunk into clarity. Wealth was measured in presence, not prestige. Gradually their plans shifted from someday to soon. They began researching homes not far from the coast. Not glamorous estates marketed in glossy brochures, but modest cottages found in hidden listings. He surprised her one afternoon, inviting her to drive hours just to see one small place leaning against the wind. It was crooked. Roof tiles missing. Garden overrun. But when they stood inside, air smelling faintly of dust and salt, she looked around with wide eyes. It feels like us. He grinned. Then it's perfect. Are you sure? She asked quietly. It's not luxury. It's not what you're used to. He reached for her hand, squeezing it firmly. What I used to have was noise. What I want now is us. And this place already feels more alive than every penthouse I ever slept in. Her heart clenched at the sincerity. This wasn't a man tolerating simplicity, he was choosing it. Back in the city they began preparing. It wasn't running away. It was running toward. Selling off what he didn't need. Giving away what had weighed him down. She shed doubts with each passing day, witnessing not just his words but his constancy. He no longer disappeared into meetings or silences. If her eyes clouded, he noticed. If her hand reached, he held it. If her laugh lit the air, he listened as if it were the only sound on earth. For the first time in years, she no longer feared being a shadow in his empire. She was the center of it. But one night, as they sifted through boxes, she asked the question lingering at the edge of every plan. What if we're wrong? What if someday you regret letting it all go? He paused, looking up from the stack of books he was packing into a crate. If I regret anything, he said softly, it will never be this. It'll be the years I spent believing happiness was something I had to buy, instead of something I could simply live. Her eyes shimmered with quiet tears, though she blinked them away quickly. Then maybe we're finally building the right kind of empire. They laughed, packed, dreamed, but beneath the joy was recognition of one more truth. This peace had been hard-won. It had cost them years of aching, distance, mistakes, and nearly losing everything. And because of that, every new plan mattered more. Because now they weren't just building homes or futures. They were building meaning. Still, the world doesn't give up easily. And as news spread of the billionaire who had traded power for love and simplicity, the outside voice returned, not as ridicule this time but as curiosity. Neighbors whispered. Old colleagues shook their heads. Strangers sent letters, some praising, some mocking. He ignored them all. But she noticed. She noticed the postmarks, the voices of people who still couldn't believe he had chosen her over billions. She asked him gently, does it bother you? That they'll never stop talking? He smiled, lifting another box onto his shoulder. Let them talk. Their voices don't build homes. Their doubts don't plant tulips. Their stories aren't ours. And in her heart she knew he was right. Their new empire wasn't measured in external validation. It was measured in laughter, tulips, and the rhythm of waves waiting to be heard each morning. But as they packed the last box, one final quiet question lingered in her chest. If life tests us again, harder than before, will we still hold on? And fate, as if listening, was ready with one last test. The van was packed. Boxes stacked high in the back rattled as the engine turned over. Their entire lives fit into cardboard crates and worn suitcases, books, a battered lamp, tulip pots bound in cloth, his notebooks, her journals. He looked over at her as they pulled away from the city's heartbeat. She leaned against the window, eyes flicking between the skyline fading in the rearview mirror and the horizon opening ahead of them. For the first time in years she looked almost weightless. Almost. Because fear has a way of sneaking into joy. When they finally arrived at the cottage by the sea, weathered wood, uneven steps, shutters clattering loosely against the breeze, she froze. Outwardly she smiled, commenting on how the salty air carried freedom in its scent. But later that night, as the waves boomed against dark rocks and the first stars unfurled above the water, she turned to him. "Do you ever worry," she whispered, her voice hushed by fear, "that we left too much behind? What if this doesn't work? What if love isn't enough?" Her words pierced him deeper than ridicule or gossip ever had. He clasped her hand. "Then we'll build from nothing like we did before. And if everything goes wrong and the only thing left is you and me, we'll still have more than I ever had at the top." She nodded, but her breath trembled. Even when love heals, scars still ache. The first weeks in the cottage taught them that simplicity is harder than it looks. Leaks dripped through the roof. Wind shoved at loose windows until nights shivered with drafts. The stove coughed before warming and groceries required long drives into town. It was romantic in the daylight. In storms it was grueling. One night, after hours of battling rain with hastily nailed planks, he slumped on the floor, soaked and frustrated. She wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, sat beside him and whispered, "You could have chosen an empire that fixed problems with a phone call. Do you regret this?" He looked at her, water still dripping from his hair. His chest rose and fell, heavy, but his voice when it came was calm. "Not once." It wasn't perfection that proved his choice, it was endurance. But the world hadn't completely loosened its grip. Letters arrived again, forwarded by confused contacts from his old life. Most were noise. But one evening an envelope landed that carried weight. Inside was an offer, staggering, absurd, more wealth than even his empire had granted in its prime. Not just to return, but to own again. A chance to rise higher than before with the golden promise, "You can start over, richer than ever, stronger than ever." Her face paled when she saw it. She didn't need to ask if the numbers tempted him. Numbers tempt everyone. For a moment, silence thickened until even the ocean outside seemed to wait. Finally he ripped the letter in half. Then again until only scraps blew into the fireplace ash. "You're still terrified I'll trade us for them," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "Let this be proof, I already traded them for us. And I won't go back." Tears filled her eyes, relief, sorrow for scars, hope stitched together again. She threw her arms around him, pressing her face against his chest. "Then maybe I can finally stop waiting for you to leave me behind." Their cottage echoed with silence again, but this time it was the silence of peace. The storms passed. Spring came. Tulips sprouted in the garden, small green shoots promising fragile blooms. She spent hours writing at her desk by the window, pages filling with words shaped by waves and wind. He tended the garden, repaired cracks, cooked meals with the clumsy pride of someone still learning. Together they walked the shoreline barefoot, laughing when gulls chased them. And as seasons shifted, the world's noise faded into insignificance. Still neither forgot the truth: love isn't proven once. It's proven again and again, over breakfasts and repairs, in storms and letters, through fear and forgiveness. But having faced ambition's cruelty, ridicule's bite, temptation's shadow, and even love's near death, they had learned the art of choosing each other every day. When the village folk spoke of them months later, they didn't call him the billionaire. They didn't mention the rise or the empire or the scandal of throwing it away. They simply said, "That couple by the sea, the ones always laughing together." The anonymousness he had once feared became the crown he wore proudly. Late one evening, with tulips blooming outside the window, she asked him softly, "Do you still regret the boy's poverty? The climb? The losses in between?" He thought for a long moment and shook his head. "I regret how blind I was. But every scar, every stumble, without them I wouldn't have known the value of this moment." She leaned closer, her smile touched with tears. "Then maybe the real fortune isn't what you built from nothing. It's what you kept when you almost lost everything." He kissed her forehead gently, his reply steady as a vow, "The fortune is us." And outside, the ocean clapped its eternal applause, carrying their story into the endless horizon. The ocean became their clock. Days marked by the way waves crashed harder in storms or softened into whispers at dawn. Nights marked by the rhythm of tides under moonlight, lullabies eternal. Life had slowed, yet for the first time he felt alive. One morning he woke before her. The cottage was quiet, the salty air sneaking through open shutters, tulips nodding against the glass. He watched her sleep, her hand curled gently on the blanket, her hair spilling messily across the pillow. And for the billionth time he thought the same truth: she is my wealth. She is my fortune. She is the empire I almost lost. He walked outside, notebook in hand. Sitting on the porch overlooking the cliffs, he wrote, not business plans, not future empires, but a letter to her. Not to impress, not to convince, just to tell the truth he wished he had told earlier. When she awoke and found the folded letter by her cup of tea, she smiled softly. His handwriting was raw, imperfect, but the words carried more than diamonds ever could. "I built towers, but I forgot who I was. You reminded me. You loved me when I was broke, you endured me when I was blind, and you tested me until I could be true again. If the world remembers me as the man who gave everything for love, so be it. But if you remember me simply as the man who chose you every day, then I have lived the richest life of all." She pressed the letter to her chest, tears prickling her eyes, then walked outside to him. He was repairing the fence, clumsy as always, mismatched nails sticking out at odd angles. "Your handwriting is awful," she teased, eyes glistening. He grinned, wiping sweat from his brow. But the message was clear. She nodded, silently slipping her arms around him. As spring bled into summer, their rhythm deepened. She finished her first manuscript in years, pages stained with ink and coffee rings. He played melodies at dusk, soft enough that neighbors walking past paused just to listen. They invited lonely villagers for dinner, hosted laughter instead of investors, gave away what little they had in spirit if not in coin. And slowly the story of the couple by the sea spread. Not gossip anymore, not scandal, not even legend. Just inspiration. Because here was proof, in flesh and laughter, that fortune without love is plague and poverty with love is wealth. One evening, as the sun melted orange across the horizon, she turned to him with a serious gaze. "Do you realize what your story really is?" she asked softly. He tilted his head, curious. She reached for his hand. "It's not about how you went from broke to billionaire. That's what the world thinks. The real story is about how love tested you, in secret, away from the cameras, in cracked apartments and lonely dinners, and how in the end you passed. Not because you found billions, but because you found your way back to us." His throat tightened, and for a long moment he couldn't speak. Finally he whispered, "Then let them print their headlines. Because you just wrote the only one that matters." She smiled, leaning into him as the horizon swallowed the sun. Years later, when wrinkles lined their hands and tulips bent with age, their story was still told, not by business magazines or reporters chasing headlines. It was told by neighbors, by villagers, by their own children who grew up hearing about the boy with patched shoes and the girl who believed in him when life gave them nothing. The story was simple, timeless, always whispered with awe. They had everything, they lost everything, and in the end they discovered the one thing worth everything: love. And whenever people visited their cottage by the sea, drawn by curiosity, by rumor, by whispers of something greater than wealth, they never left dazzled by riches. They left touched by the sight of two people still holding hands at sunset, still laughing in kitchens, still proving daily that the truest empire is built not in skyscrapers or stock markets, but in the unwavering choice to love, again and again. The boy who had once been broke. The man who once became a billionaire. The partner who almost lost love. The soul who finally understood. His fortune wasn't written in numbers, It was written in her laughter, their resilience, their simplicity, their togetherness. And that is the secret no market ever measured, no report ever published, no empire ever knew. That the richest man in the world is the one who can say with no hesitation, I chose love, and it was worth everything I gave away. The waves crashed. The stars arrived. And the tale hung in the air like an eternal vow.